Salmon Podcast มันสดอร่อย
In the Name of Work podcast, getting your work to really work with Parit Wacharasindhu.
In collaboration with Rise.
Welcome back, everyone, to our podcast, In the Name of Work. This is Parit Wacharasindhu, your host. As usual in this podcast, we're going to be talking to business experts across the world on different areas that will shape the future of all our work, as well as getting their personal tips on how to work more efficiently, more effectively, and how to make it more fun. Or as we like to say in this podcast, how to get your work to really work for you. I think it's hard to deny that technology has changed the way we do things and has given rise to many different new business models. 10 years ago, who would have thought that one of the biggest taxi companies in the world would own no cars? Who would have thought that one of the biggest accommodation providers in the world would own no building? We're, of course, talking about Uber and Airbnb. Across a similar vein, in the media industry, who would have thought that one of the biggest media platforms in the world would actually write no original content? And here we're, of course, talking about Facebook and other social media channels. I think the last example I mentioned is probably a testament to how much social media has disrupted traditional media. However, today we're going to be talking to someone who has actually been able to lead a digital transformation at one of the more traditional media companies from within. Apart from her experiences as Chief Digital Officer at The Guardian in the United Kingdom, Ms. Tanya Cordrey has also had plenty of experiences in building other digital products and services. Hi, Tanya. Welcome to our podcast.
Thank you so much. It's fantastic to be here.
Thank you for joining us. I think, firstly, just wanted to get your perspective on what's happening in the media industry. Now, I understand that you joined The Guardian back in 2008. Is that correct?
Yes, quite a while ago now.
Can you share with us a little bit about what the media was like back then? Kind of where were people getting their content? What was the landscape?
Certainly. I mean, it's amazing how much things have changed since then. But looking back to when I first started as the Guardian's Chief Digital Officer, the world was very different. And the Guardian at that point was very UK-centric and very print-centric. Of course, the majority of revenue came from the print revenues. And The Guardian had actually done quite a lot in digital, but it was still seen as a relatively small part of the business. And it was unclear how important it was going to be for the years ahead. By the time I left, which was about 4 or 5 years ago now, when I left The Guardian, it had become very global, outward-facing. It was very digital-centric. And we had got to the point where there were real foundations of commercial success rooted in digital. It also including the very first beginning of its membership revenue streams, which obviously is critical for its success today. So there was a lot of change in a relatively short period of time.
Sorry, I think just quickly on that point, Tanya, you mentioned that The Guardian was doing some digital, although not a lot, back in 2008. Can you elaborate a little bit on what they were doing?
So there was a digital team, but I think in many ways, digital was seen in support of the newspaper. So, for example, I remember there was a discussion in the early days while I was there about if you broke a story. And at those very early days, if The Guardian had a big story, which it often did, it would want initially to save it for the paper the very next day, which is an anathema to today's digital world, because as soon as you have a story, you publish it online. But the idea of having a big breaking story online in those early days was quite unusual. The only reason you would do that is if you thought the competition would print or publish something online before you. By the time I left, that attitude had completely disappeared, and you printed your news obviously in the paper, but as soon as you had a story, it went live online. And I think a really great example of that while I was at The Guardian was when The Guardian broke the Edward Snowden story. I was very fortunate to be there during that time. And The Guardian did something that was almost unheard of during that period, because it actually released the story on a Sunday afternoon, and it didn't even release it. The first thing it released was on Twitter. And it was quite incredible because it showed at that point how difficult many news organizations found digital, because The Guardian released this story on Twitter. It went crazy, and the traditional media companies around the world struggled to keep up. So even people like CNN, who would do their news kind of broadcast on the Guardian story, revealing that Edward Snowden was the whistleblower, they were constantly out of date because digital was moving far too quickly. Even Google News at that point struggled to keep up with how quickly the story was progressing. So very radical change just in that sort of 5-year period.
So when you joined The Guardian, did you feel that the leaders of the organization knew that this was something that was coming? Or do you think they all of these changes were a little bit unexpected, and then when it happened, you guys were able to kind of ride on that wave?
I think I was very fortunate. The sort of editor-in-chief, Alan Rusbridger, and the CEO, Andrew Miller, I think were completely aligned that this was going to be really important. And I think my appointment and giving the title Chief Digital Officer was testimony to their belief in that. I think where there was probably some more reticence, or there were still people to be persuaded, was actually probably more in the middle of the organization. I don't think anybody was denying that digital would be important, but I think people were, how would I describe it? They didn't want to think of the prospect of print being less important than it was today. So if I think about my role at the time as a chief digital officer, there were two functions of it. There was the managing of the digital team, which was product, technology, engineering, data, growth, user experience, etc. And they were very much the sort of functional elements of the role. But in the early days of being a chief digital officer, your role was also to be the champion of digital across the organization. My role was there to also persuade other departments, whether sales or marketing or editorial, and get them to truly embrace all the exciting digital opportunities. I remember at the time having an interesting conversation with one of my peers on our exec team, and they described my role as pushing the organization to be bolder than it would have been naturally. And he described it at the time that he would see that without having a chief digital officer, you would have a discussion and you might agree to a path, but you might only go from, say, A to H. That's the sort of spectrum. And he viewed having the chief digital officer to be somebody who's painting the picture of the land of XYZ, if that makes sense. So even though you wouldn't necessarily get the organization to the land of XYZ, you would definitely push them further than they would have naturally got if you hadn't been at the table.
How did your competitors deal with all this? Did they also kind of have a similar point in time, perhaps kind of before or after, where they realized digital is going to be important? They get someone in to do a similar role to what you did with The Guardian, or kind of what do you think happened in those boardrooms while you were discussing these things with The Guardian leadership?
Well, I think it's really interesting, and I think you see it. I'm on the board of Clark's Shoes, and I think you see a lot of this in retail as well. So I think at the time when I was at The Guardian, we were definitely one of the few media companies leading the pack, and we were being very bold and innovative in our thinking. I mean, I would say that, but I think The Guardian's growth during that time was testimony to the fact that we were doing digital really well. And I think at the beginning of my tenure at The Guardian, I suspect Mark Thompson, who's been obviously the now departed CEO of the New York Times, I suspect at the very beginning days, Mark Thompson in his boardroom didn't even necessarily think of The Guardian as competition. We were a British newspaper. In fact, The Guardian, I think at that time was, forgive me if I've got the number slightly wrong, but it was something like the 7th largest newspaper in the UK. So it wasn't even like in the top 3. So I suspect the folks at the New York Times weren't really thinking of The Guardian as competition. But by the time I left, in terms of digital, The Guardian had overtaken the New York Times globally in its monthly number of users. I think it's probably overtaken it, The Guardian, again nowadays. I don't know what the figures are. But so I think people were surprised by the growth and the sort of exponential growth that you saw at The Guardian. However, when I think of other industries, when you look at it today, it's really hard building sustainable competitive advantage, because I think a lot of what we did that was successful very quickly got copied by other media companies. We built a really best-in-class digital team. Other newspapers built a best-in-class digital team. And we pioneered really sort of new ways of working. But those sort of things, they might give you operational advantage, but they don't give you long-lasting, sustainable competitive advantage, because others can do that as well. And I think when I look at, for example, if I look at the Financial Times today, I think they're in many ways really leading the pack by pushing the new frontiers of subscription and really innovative ways of working.
I like how you mentioned about kind of the shifting nature of competition and how who you see as a competitor changes. So who would you say The Guardian saw as its competitors back in 2008? And who do you think are your main competitors now? Has that changed yet?
Yeah, no, it definitely has changed. So I think at The Guardian, when I started, if we go back all that period of time, I think if you'd asked people who the competition was, they would have said the Times of London or the Daily Telegraph, etc. But actually today, I think the answer you would get is very different. Now, they might say something like the New York Times, but I'm actually a big believer that your competition isn't necessarily another media company. We as individuals only have so much disposable time. So your news outlet is also vying for attention, whether it be social media, Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, etc. It's also vying for, I don't know, whether you're going to go for a nice walk on a sunny day as it is in London today, etc. So I think you have to be quite broad in who the competition is, just as your great examples of the beginning of this session. Taxi firms would never have necessarily thought that their competition was going to come from a car that from an organization that didn't own a single car, and same with hotel chains with Airbnb. So I think you have to be very cognizant that the competition is often not that obvious, and it can really come from left field.
How much do you think kind of the decision by The Guardian to lead the way in terms of digital transformation was down to the rise of social media? Or do you think it regardless of whether social media came in, this was the way to go anyway?
We actually had really started on digital transformation before social media. It's hard to imagine a time, but in the early days, social media was really in its infancy. And one of the reasons, you're right, one of the reasons that The Guardian had great growth during that period of time is that we utterly embraced social media. We believed wholeheartedly at the time that we didn't, or rather we shouldn't spend our efforts on trying to always get our users to come to us, but we needed to be where our users were going to be. And that meant we had to be on different platforms, such as social media. And we really embraced social media. So a good example, many people won't remember this, but in the early days of Facebook, I can't remember exactly what they called it, but they did some experiments with some publishers, and they took a handful of publishers and they were looking at how you would share content from publications. And the UK and the Guardian was the only publication they picked outside of the US. But what they did with their social sharing is that they basically shared every time you read something, all your friends and connections would see what you read. But actually there was a huge backlash, funny enough, at the time, that people didn't necessarily want the information they're reading to be shared without some sort of explicit consent. So Facebook rolled it back very, very quickly. But even though that experiment was sort of deemed to be a failure at the time, from Facebook's point of view, just by participating in it, we learned so much about the workings of social media that it really set us up for success for the next 1, 2, 3 years.
So you mentioned earlier about kind of the benefits of digital for a media company, right? For example, the ability to break that big story without having to wait for the next day for the papers to be printed. What kind of other big ideas did you kind of think up of and kind of suggested or recommended or executed even at the beginning of your Guardian career?
Well, I would actually say that anything we did was very much a team effort. I'm not sure I could lay credit to any one thing completely down to me. So I think there was very much the push on social media. That was a very big thing we did during that time. Another big thing we did was, it sounds like a very small thing, but we changed the Guardian's URL, the domain name, from guardian.co.uk to theguardian.com. At the time, even though this sounds like a very small URL change, it was an enormously scary, huge engineering project. And at that time, nobody changed their domain names because they were petrified that they would lose all the lovely Google juice. And at that point, Google was a significant proportion, probably the largest driver of traffic to the Guardian website. And when you change your domain name, there's a good chance you might lose a good chunk of it, if not all of it. But it made the right sense for us to do strategically. We were trying to grow revenues outside the United Kingdom. US advertisers, for example, were not interested on advertising on a .co.uk site. But we really pushed ahead with doing that. And even though we were told privately by one very large search engine, they believed it to be the largest domain move ever undertaken, we still had the courage and belief to do it. And once that had bedded down, we saw huge growth in our user numbers because it made our brand feel so much more relevant. As a quick aside, I think one of the things I found really exciting during that time was that after we made the domain change, we saw over the next period of time, when big stories broke, we would see people turning to The Guardian to find out what had happened with those stories. Now, you would expect that for UK readers to turn to a UK news site, but actually, for example, when there were big stories like Charlie Hebdo happened in France, we would see a huge spike in French traffic as French readers still wanted to see the global perspective of The Guardian. The same when there were other big stories, for example, in Asia, when we had the big tsunami in Japan, etc. We had huge numbers of Japanese users. And I think that's real testimony to the global outlook we had done. The other thing I think it's worth saying is that probably one of the it was seen as a small experiment at the time, but became huge, was that we started experimenting with this idea that people would give money to The Guardian, which today is very much the sort of foundation of their revenue strategy, this idea of membership. And I remember there was a wonderful member of my team, a chap called Piers Jones, and he was really keen to do an experiment where you just ask people to send us money. And the reason he wanted to do this, we had a very unusual problem at The Guardian, was that every once in a while, in fact, it would happen sort of every 2 weeks or so, the editor would receive an envelope full of cash where somebody had basically said, I love The Guardian so much, I want to give you money and I don't know how. Please have £10 or £5 or what have you. In fact, once I was there, I remember Alan, the editor at the time, he sent a note out to all the staff and said that a very devoted Guardian reader had died. And in their will, they had left money to basically buy everybody at The Guardian a drink one night in the bar. So there was huge goodwill, and the team, led by Piers, was really keen, and he just did this very quick experiment where you politely said to people, hey, we don't charge a subscription, but it would be, we'd politely like to ask if you would like to donate to our journalism, etc. And that small experiment was a huge success and proved to be the first acorn of the kind of oak that is the subscription membership strategy of The Guardian today.
We'll come to the business model in a second and the challenges of kind of monetizing content. But I think the 2 points you mentioned there, I think illustrate quite well how consumer behavior or reader behavior has changed, right? So for example, shifting from reading your local or your national media outlet to reading a more global one. And then secondly, actually being willing to pay for or even donate and give away to a media outlet that they love. Have you seen any other kind of shifts in consumer behavior over the kind of past 10 or 15 years in terms of kind of the type of content they like, kind of the way they get to content, or any kind of expectations that they have that's shifted from media outlets? Yep.
Yeah, I think there have been lots and lots of changes. So some that I would mention, for example, if you were to go back, say, 15 years ago or so, probably people had one place that they would go. It'd be their default, I'm going to go and read the news at the BBC. And they really tended to get their news from one source. That is so far from what happens today. Most people today, they might have a favorite news source, but they supplement it with many, many others. So there are many points of view, many voices, and even though some news organizations still remain to be the favorite, they no longer have a monopoly of people's time. And I also think it means that the users are far more demanding because they're far more likely nowadays to challenge what a journalist says because they're reading lots of other things from lots of other outlets as well. And I personally think that is a really good and healthy dynamic. So you have that. I think people come and find their content in all different places nowadays. So again, it's not about going to your favorite news site. You'll find it on social media. You'll get it through voice with things like Alexa. There's talk now of potentially we'll see the rise of gaming. It might be that at some point you're getting your news through games and Discord, etc. So it constantly sort of evolves. It's one of the really interesting things about news and media. Funnily enough, I like to think of the world in terms of S-curves. We live through many, many S-curves. So we have the sort of internet S-curve, mobile S-curve. And often at the very beginning of the S-curve, people tend to try and produce fairly simple products. And almost always, news is one of those very first sort of products at the beginning of an S-curve, which makes it a fascinating industry because you're often one of the first who's grappling with these new dynamics of user behavior.
Now, you mentioned that in a way, kind of the rise of social media and the rise of digital has kind of democratized the media industry.
Yeah.
So it kind of reduced that monopolization. Now, of course, that also means on the flip side for The Guardian is that you're getting competition from kind of normal people who just kind of write articles, write content on social media that gets shared. So kind of with that kind of context in mind, how are you able to charge money for content when so much good free content is available in the world?
Yeah. I think it's fair to say it's really tough. And as somebody who's, while I was at The Guardian and since leaving, I'm often asked to talk about the media industry. And inevitably, everybody always comes to the business model because, my goodness me, it is really tough, the business model. So I think the media industry generally has done an amazing job with subscriptions. I mean, look at the New York Times. They have done a fantastic job with subscriptions. I was on the board for several years of a Scandinavian media company called Schibsted, which at the time also had sort of was a classified powerhouse across the world as well. And Schibsted did really well at pushing subscriptions as well across Scandinavia, in Norway and Sweden, etc. And I think what you see with subscriptions, in many ways, they may be slow to begin with, but when there is, put bluntly, as a user, when it gets really hard to find places to get your news for free, eventually somebody will go, okay, I'm going to have to subscribe. And at that point, there's a much more of a willingness to subscribe to a product. And I think generally we're all a lot more relaxed nowadays of subscribing, because we're used to subscribing to Netflix, we're used to subscribing to Amazon Prime. You see subscription services. Right now, I can't move for social media with people doing subscription services for flower deliveries, for example. Or I saw one the other day for athletic wear. VCs are loving subscription services because the average revenue per user and lifetime value is very significant. But funnily enough, I think I don't think subscriptions are going to go away. But I think a couple of things will also happen. You have The Guardian, who's pioneered membership. And we're also seeing that at places like the Washington Post, who've also pushed this idea of subscription, but morphing it into membership. Because journalism is something where actually, it's not necessarily the story, but it's the journalism, the understanding the world. It has a much deeper resonance with people that if you can tap into that, they're much more willing to pay for it. Saying this, this also might be very controversial, but I also think we'll see a resurgence of advertising revenue. Right now, nobody in the newspaper world really wants to go near advertising or really talks about it, even though it still generates significant revenue. And it's been particularly tough during COVID because revenues from advertising have plummeted over the last few months. But as a consumer, and it's always dangerous talking about yourself, I mean, I don't really like adverts. I find them intrusive. And right now, it seems that many advertisers feel they have to make the ads even more intrusive, which means I get more irritated. But with artificial intelligence, machine learning, I really hope we're going to see a period of much more intelligent advertising that's much more relevant and in context with my needs. I might find advertising irritating, but you know what? I want to go on holiday and I would like to know about what are the great places and options that I have. Or I might want to do a meal delivery service. Now, there are lots of those, and I'd like maybe somebody advertised so I can know which one's going to be best suited to my needs. So I think advertising has got a bit of a bad rap, partly because advertisers themselves, I think, have been rather slow to really adopt technology to meet people's needs. But I think we're going to see quite a few changes over the next few years, and we'll see a resurgence of advertising revenue because media companies, I hope, will be the first ones to really help push a new type of advertisements going forward.
So I think one example of a smart advertising idea you mentioned is the use of AI to make sure that what is advertised fits with the reader's kind of needs and wants.
Yeah.
Another type of smart advertising that I've seen quite a lot are kind of sponsored content where you're not really sure if it's an advert or it's original content. Now, my question on this is, where do you draw the ethical line, right? I think this is something which is a question posed to a lot of journalists and a lot of kind of media companies. But where do you draw the ethical line to prevent kind of, let's say, like someone with a vested interest? It could be a business. It could even be like a politician to come in with like a certain amount of money and say, write good content about me, write good content about us.
Yeah. So sponsored content is always a really tricky one. And the reason I say it's tricky because there is that line to make sure you don't cross it. Now, I think where you have traditional publishers like The Guardian, and I'm sure they're exactly the same today, and I know even newer publishers like BuzzFeed are categorical that the editorial team and the sort of commercial team producing the content, never the twain shall meet. So theoretically, you should have a company that's able to have sponsored content and the editorial team could be quite happily finding out the biggest, most terrible story about that company at the same time, and no influence should be exerted. Speaking very, very personally, I struggle with sponsored content because I think it seems like an obvious way to generate revenue for media organizations, but I think it goes back to the point that advertising isn't quite working. So if you had much more relevant advertising, then I think you would do away with the sort of sponsored content as we know it today. Because, again, using myself as an example, which is a bad thing to do, as if whenever I'm helping organizations build digital products, I tell them never to think of yourself as the user. But whenever I'm seeing something and I see some sponsored content, personally, I never read it. I kind of dismiss it straight out of hand. So I think it could be in sort of 5 years plus time, I think sponsored content will look, I hope sponsored content will look very, very different than it does today.
Now, you mentioned the use of AI for advertisers to make their advertising more smart and more personalized, right? Do you think along similar lines for the media company itself to personalize kind of news and articles for that specific user? And did you try a lot of this while you were at The Guardian?
Yeah, we played around with some of that at The Guardian. I mean, it was early days in it, but I think the idea that everybody wants to read all the same stories clearly makes no sense. And most large news organizations are pumping out hundreds and hundreds of articles a day, which frankly, no normal human being could even come close to reading it all. So I think you definitely have to be smarter around putting the right content in front of the right people. Now, with media organizations, there is definitely an element of curation that people value. They want to know what you think is the biggest story of the day. They don't want to have to go hunting for that. But when you look at the long tail of content, I think you have to really be smart, and AI, machine learning offer huge opportunities to allow people to find those real relevant nuggets of things that are of interest to them that otherwise they might not find. Saying that, one of the things I notice from many media companies is that they're all very excited about machine learning and want to do personalization through machine learning. However, for some reason, I don't understand why sometimes they don't just ask the user. Nobody knows the preferences better than the user themselves. And right now, I'd say many media companies are being rather shy of complementing the use of sort of machine learning with actually giving the user more chance themselves to push content up or push content down. I don't know why media companies have been somewhat resistant in doing that, but I would really like to. I predicted this probably a couple of years ago and it hasn't come to pass, but I will predict it again. I think in the next 2-3 years, we'll see media companies really giving more power to their users. And it won't just be the content. It might even be the way of the page look and feel, how you get something on your mobile device, because it might be that I'm sitting in the evening and I want an experience that is centered around long reads. I want at the end of the day to read some analytical articles, understand the world around me, maybe have a sort of bit of serendipity and find some completely obscure topic, but it'll be interesting to read about. Whereas at the beginning of the day, I might want just lots and lots of headlines, and I want it to look different because I'm going through many items of news very, very quickly. And again, news organizations don't tend to allow for that change of context. And I just say, well, actually allow the users to do it. At The Guardian, and again, this is a sort of rather old example, but I think it's a very relevant example. We did some changes to the Guardian app, and we allowed users to change, to toggle from a different look and feel. And much to our amazement, around 25% of the user base did want to change the look and feel. So I think many organizations would say, this sounds like a great idea, but in reality, only a tiny percentage of people will use it. I actually think if this becomes a default, you will see significant numbers of users wanting to change not only the priority and the types of content, but also the way it looks and how it's presented to them.
I think on that point, we see the rise of the formation of certain new kind of media startups that have tried a little bit experimenting with that. So getting users to kind of choose what type of news they want to see, what format of news or what format of content they want to see. Do you feel that kind of new organizations that have no kind of previous pride in being kind of valued for their expertise in curating content and having their own content are better adapt and less resistant towards doing this? Is there an element of, because you've been a news agency for so long and you're very proud of your rich history of being looked up to as the experts for telling people what is the thing they should read, what is the news that they should be hearing about? Therefore, there's higher resistance in doing that.
Oh, without a shadow of a doubt. I think the biggest enemy to news organizations is themselves. They tie themselves in knots over sort of the inner workings of their organization, and newer startups can be completely free from that sort of baggage. So a sort of small example, but if you look at a traditional news organization and you look at how they categorize the content, whether it be news, opinion, economics, sport, that is also the same as the organizational structure within the organization. So I'm not sure which one is leading which. I actually have a horrible feeling that it's the organizational structure that is leading to the sort of UI of news sites rather than being led from user needs. So I definitely think younger organizations have a huge opportunity to get rid of that baggage. But as you quite rightly say, there's an issue of trying to build credibility, because in this age of so much information, lots of talk about fake news, disinformation, you have to really build your credibility, and that takes time. So unfortunately, there aren't shortcuts. However, it shouldn't take 200 years to do it.
I'm going to ask you a very broad question, but what do you think makes a good content?
What do I think makes good content? It all depends on the context. So, and the user. So there isn't a sort of generic rule of thumb, because for me, good content might be short, sharp information, which I can digest in a sort of bite, because, dare I say, I'm addicted to social media and I like everything in bite size. But for somebody else, they might love a 2,000-word article on the plight of polar bears, for example, and they want to read something that's relaxing, lean back, etc. I think the real element is good content understands the job it's trying to do for the user, and you tailor it for that. And I would also add that good content is about the beginning of a conversation. It shouldn't be broadcast. Just sort of you broadcast to something and it stops. A good piece of content should start a conversation, should lead to more exploration, etc. So it's the sort of beginning of a journey, not the sort of the beginning, middle, and end.
Is the competition for kind of getting the most talented journalists and content writers still as strong in this kind of digital-driven world? Or is it because there's so much content going around, everyone can kind of write their own content on their social media, the competition is slightly less strong and it's more kind of competition on how to create a better experience for the readers, how to curate the best content that fits their wants?
Yeah. So I'm not an expert I can't really talk to the recruiting of top journalists. So I can only give you a supposition. And if there's anybody who is an editor recruiting and I'm talking rubbish, then hopefully they'll contact you and say, I violently disagree with her. My personal take on this would be there's always going to be competition for really fantastic writers. But in any profession, there's probably only a small percentage of them. There is an enormous number of other people who write either in news organizations or write on blogs. They write posts on Medium or set up their own emails on Substack, etc. So there are many people who can write. So the hard news is, I think, if you want to break into this industry, or you're a journalist who wants to really hit the pinnacle of your career, there's a lot of competition. I suspect there are more writers than there are roles to do that. But the good news is that because there is so much competition, the cream should rise to the top, because it is very clear to all of us that when you're reading something that's written by somebody who is a master of their craft, then it is a joy to read, and you want more of it. So I think there'll always be competition for those great writers.
So we've discussed a lot about kind of the upsides of technology and how that can help kind of make more personalized content. What about the downsides? I think you mentioned briefly just now kind of fake news and disinformation. Kind of how do you see this issue of fake news in terms of what's the solution in your opinion to this issue? Because I don't think people will accept that the solution is to start censoring, right? Because it's a very kind of slippery slope of how you kind of decide each case.
It's a tricky one, because obviously everybody's grappling with that at the moment. I think the good news is that sunlight often exposes the things that are lies or wrong, etc. So that's one of the wonderful things about technology and the internet, is that if I suddenly say something that's patently false, let me find something that hopefully is completely uncontroversial. Let's say I wrote a whole piece about how polar bears are really black. It wouldn't take long before there would be many people on the internet telling me that I am wrong. So that sort of sunlight of the internet is really, really wonderful. However, it's not always so clear when something is right and something is wrong. And we live in a world today where people can be quite polarized in their views. And we know there's this issue of sort of living in filter bubbles where you can tend to read things that you want that reinforce your worldview, and other people do the same. And there's not much meeting in the middle. This is very much a personal opinion, but I think there's a really important role here for traditional news organizations, whether they're like the Financial Times or the New York Times, etc., to be able to navigate in many ways what is the truth. Now, the problem I see with that, and again, this is very much a personal opinion, is that I think a lot of those organizations have really got carried away over the last few years with publishing opinion pieces, because in the world of Facebook, hard news doesn't really get the huge numbers of traffic, but a controversial opinion does. And I think one of the downsides we've seen with the traditional media companies over the last few years, as they've pursued their social media strategy, in order to get those clicks, they've become very reliant on opinion. And as a result, I think opinion and sort of news reporting have become somewhat blurred. So I would really hope that those traditional media companies, if I was in one today, I'd very much be urging them to uncouple those two things, because I think in the eyes of the user, they're really wanting something that is devoid of opinion, or at least some part of it that's devoid of opinion, to help them understand the world they live in today and not reinforce the sort of filter bubble that they think that newspaper may be inhabiting.
I think that blurred line between fact and opinion is very important. And I think it raises a question about how much a media agency can take sides on certain issues as well. Do you have a perspective on this at all?
I'm probably my former media colleagues would howl at me with this, because they'd probably do this. But I don't quite get why newspapers feel that they need to have an opinion on everything. I mean, they tend to have opinion pieces on their own opinion very, very regularly. And the truth is, I think it's something you need to save for those really important moments, and then that opinion has some weight. I think if you give your opinion left, right, and centre, your opinion tends not to have so much weight. And for example, I remember having this conversation with a senior journalist at The Guardian while I was there, who I think thought I was somewhat mad. But there's a tradition in the UK that when you have a general election, each news organisation will pronounce who it wants to win the election a few days before the final election date. I really struggle with that personally, because I think the role of a newspaper is not to tell its readers, by the way, we think this party's better than this party. Their role is to provide them with all the information, treat them as if they're adults and say, you decide, but we furnished you with the facts that we think are most pertinent to help you make the decision that you feel is the best. Anyway, as I said, I had this conversation with a senior journalist when I was at The Guardian, because I was saying it would be amazing if The Guardian was the first newspaper in the UK to basically say, we're not going to tell you who we think we should vote for, but we're going to give you the information so you make the right decision in your head. But as I say, I think they thought I was rather mad. They weren't going to have that.
I'm guessing, I think, and this may be kind of right up your street as well, as someone who oversees the digital side of things. We often see a lot of times when news are presented online on social media, kind of the attempt to potentially over sensationalize certain news, or kind of write very provocative headlines to kind of bring in those clicks and hit those kind of KPIs. Was this something that you kind of took a stance about in the past, or how? What was your perspective on this?
Yeah, I heard a lot of. Interestingly, I mean, I'm very much talking about the media that I'm exposed to, which is obviously a very different part of the world. So I think when you look at the sort of traditional or larger news organizations, you don't really get too much of that. Funnily enough, that in the early days of social media and in the early days of really driving data within newsrooms, there was a feeling from journalists, a fear that in order to get those bigger clicks, more sensational headlines would result. But actually, again, during my time at The Guardian, we saw that the biggest stories often weren't the ones with the most big, important headlines. So I think, and again, this is a very old data point, but towards the end of my time at The Guardian, some of the biggest stories we ever had were things like a photo essay on the decline of Detroit, some really beautiful pictures of buildings of disrepair. Or, for example, there was a story on from an article from a palliative nurse who basically had helped many people in the final hours of their lives. And we'd written a story where she was talking about the most common regrets of the dying. That story was huge because it was evergreen, and it was always forever turning up on social media as other people would share it. And that was, I think, if that wasn't the biggest article, it was probably the second biggest article at the time. So I think it's those sort of quality bits of journalism at the end of the day shine through.
I think we're going to switch gears a little bit from just talking about the media industry to talking about kind of digital transformation as a whole, right? I think your story at The Guardian provides a very good inspiration to a lot of corporates out there who want to make their businesses kind of more digital oriented. What advice do you have in terms of the key success factors for undertaking a successful digital transformation from within?
Yeah, so not only have I led digital transformation in places like Clark's, places like The Guardian, I'm also on the board of somewhere like Clark's, who's undergoing digital transformation. And I also head up Europe for a consultancy called AKF Partners, which is a small group of ex-Silicon Valley CTOs, CEOs, who work with companies on how do you scale and grow and transform. So I've been very fortunate that I've seen transformation across many different types of organizations. It probably sounds rather simplistic, but I think with transformation, there are three key big foundation blocks that you need to do. The first one is you need to have a compelling vision and strategy. You need to know where you're going and how you're going to get there. And the thing about the strategy is you often see organizations say they have a strategy, but in reality, they're either focusing too much on the process and they're making outcomes, they're making process rather than outcomes their North Star. Or, for example, you see organizations that get very wrapped up around optimization. Optimization is also not a strategy. I come across organizations that are in a constant cycle of optimization that really offers little more than diminishing returns. So organizations need to be wary of this and instead focus on having a really fantastic strategy, which outlines the steps required to meet their big overall vision. The best strategies are ones that are about being different. It's about choosing a path that's hard to copy. And it's really about delivering value in your market. So the first block is all about strategy. The second block is about once you have the right strategy, you need to have the right people. It sounds obvious, but I really believe the success I've had in my career is down to the amazing people I've worked with through the years. So I think any organization that wants to transform needs to understand the skills you need to get there. And then you have to identify the right people. And if you don't have them, you need to hire them. And it's not just about having the right functional skills, but it's really about having the right mindset. And the third block, which I think is really critical, is about the ways of working. So you've got the right strategy, you've got the right people. The ways of working is about setting them up for success. And that's a whole host of different things. That's about being data-centered. It's about being customer-centered and talking to your customers a lot. It's about experimenting a lot, building that habit, about building pace and agility. It's about having a great operating model where you have a clear cadence and clarity on decision making, and a real sort of mindset around continuous learning, etc. So all these things together, there's a lot to do, but in reality, if you can kind of hit all those boxes, then you're well on your way for transformation.
Do you think there are any industries or sectors in particular that have been quite slow at undertaking this kind of digital transformation?
Yeah. The funny thing is that when I left The Guardian, I thought that surely there can't be anything that's as tough as trying to build the business model for news. And then I joined the board of clerks and you go, oh my goodness me, high street retail. And the truth is retail is behind. The media industry, funnily enough, is ahead of the curve of many other industries. So I think we've had retail has been slow, but has caught up quite quickly. And I think particularly when I think about Europe, rather than necessarily looking towards Silicon Valley for where's the initiative on e-commerce, actually, if you look towards Asia, there's lots of really exciting things there happening on retail and e-commerce. I think now we're seeing some of the slow organizations have probably been some of the traditional banks, financial services. Insurance is another interesting area. There's lots of opportunity there with AI, machine learning, etc., which is actually forcing digital transformation. I saw a funny thing the other day, and it was going around social media, and it was a little picture of a survey, and the survey said, who's done more to drive digital transformation in your organization? A, the CEO, B, the CFO, C, COVID-19. And the clear winner was COVID-19. And I think there are lots of data points now emerging that are showing that companies have probably achieved more in the last 3-4 months than they probably would have achieved in the last kind of 2-3 years, just because they've been forced to work in very different ways and to be much more innovative and bolder on their business model to survive.
If we go back to your kind of 3 building blocks
Yes.
for successful transformation, right? You mentioned having a clear strategy, so knowing what to do, having the right people, and then kind of having the right ways of working. And then when you look at kind of these industries that have been quite slow at undertaking digital transformation, which of the 3 building blocks do you feel are missing for most of the companies that are unable to do it?
I think the biggest building blocks that are missing are often around the strategy, because I've seen a lot of companies get really caught up with things like saying they want to be number 1 or number 2 in the market. And that isn't a strategy. That's saying where you want to get to, but it's not telling you how you're going to get there. So I think there's a piece about the strategy is really important. And I think another missing piece often is around having a bigger vision, because there is a scarcity of talent at the moment, and you really need to appeal to people's heads and their hearts. People want to work for mission-driven organizations. They want to feel something, they want to feel part of something bigger than themselves. So lots of companies can do that. You don't have to be a media company. You don't have to be a charity. You can be any sort of company, but you need to spend time articulating that big, bold vision that really inspires your team. So I think the strategy piece is missing and the vision piece is often missing. And the second bit is the people. And that is a simple matter of supply and demand. I think it's been very easy for the likes of Google and Facebook and Apple and Amazon to recruit. They pay incredibly well, you learn a lot, and they're amazing companies. And it's pretty hard if you are a smaller company, not a sexy startup, because they often attract lots of great talent. But if you're a company undergoing digital transformation, it's really hard to attract fantastic talent. So I think in that situation, a lot of these more traditional companies are realizing they're having to grow their own talent. They need to provide the training, the learning to help shift the mindset, to give them the skills, but also to give them the sort of the understanding that the mindset needs to change as well, which means you're looking at pace and agility and moving fast. And if things don't work, be relaxed about it, etc. And have all those sort of data-centric pieces. So it's possible, but that thing has really, I think, slowed a lot of people down. Just the sheer lack of talented people to go around for everyone.
I think in the past, most people would probably agree that technology has created opportunities for new businesses, right? It allowed kind of a couple of teenagers in a dorm room to come up with a new business model and succeed. Do you feel that kind of looking further ahead, there will be a point where technology actually reduces competition because of things like the network effect? The example you mentioned is companies like Google, with such a kind of a strong reputation, can attract the best talent. It makes it even more difficult for someone to start anew. Or, for example, if let's say like a news or a media company is able to gain such a high number of users, it's likely to attract kind of the kind of a new customer coming in would be attracted to that as well. So that's that kind of network effect happening, which could potentially dampen competition, right?
Yeah, I think this is a really good point. I remember reading a stat that I'm going to sort of make up the stat. So don't quote me on this because this is. But there was something really incredible that Google has more artificial intelligence PhDs working for it than there are in the rest of the world, or something crazy like that. So there are these large companies hoovering up talent. I think we're at a really interesting point because over the last couple of decades, we've seen many companies rise and many companies fall. I lived through dot-com boom. So I myself worked for a company that was the darling of Wall Street for a while and then had a spectacular bust. Many people who use Google probably forget that there were search engines before that, the likes of Netscape, etc. But the trouble is that when we look back on that, we expect that the big tech giants we have today, it's only a matter of time before they'll be disrupted. But actually, I think you raise a really interesting point that maybe it's not going to quite work like that. I heard a fascinating podcast. I can't remember who did it. I think it might have been an Andreessen Horowitz podcast, but I might be incorrect there. But it was talking about the car companies. And actually, the car companies have stayed. If you ignore Tesla, we have had the same car manufacturing companies for decades and decades and decades, and they haven't changed. And they have remained market leaders. And there's a question now, are Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, the new car companies who are actually going to be in situ for many, many decades because they have the resources, they have the reach, and as you quite rightly said, they have talent. And as somebody who loves technology and loves the industry, I like the idea of this fast churn. But something in my pit of my stomach says these large companies are going to be around for many, many, many years to come.
You mentioned that one way for corporates to get around the issue of not being able to recruit top digital talent is to kind of develop from within, right? What advice do you have in terms of initiatives or methods of training up kind of traditionally analog trained kind of talent or workforce to become more kind of digital savvy and digital oriented?
So I think organizations probably need to look at their learning and development budget. And if they're in that situation, they need to probably invest a lot more than they have done traditionally. So as I mentioned previously, you can teach skills, but it's really hard to change somebody's mindset. So the first thing I would say is if you're an executive in an organization, you need to identify people in your organization who have the right mindset, who are going to be comfortable with change, comfortable with uncertainty, who are already showing a passion for continuous learning. If you've got somebody who's the diametrically opposite to that, then I'm going to say that it might be kind of hard to change, and you have to be wary about necessarily investing in people who aren't really interested in going on the journey. But let's say you have a group of people who are all completely of the right mindset, then I think you just need to think about what are the skills you want to build up, and then make sure you've got the right training in place. And training should be short, sharp. I'm a big believer in, we do this at a lot of AKF actually. We like doing training. We do CTO boot camps, we do engineering kind of boot camps, we do product strategy courses, we do finance for tech people, etc. And the aim isn't to sort of draw people in to be on a training schedule that goes on for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks and months. What we want to do, and I believe this is a great way of learning, is give people the knowledge of what good looks like, and then give them the skills that they can carry on their lifelong learning. Because actually, the best people I've ever worked with are the folks who are always hungry for more knowledge. And even though you send them on a training course, once they've got their new skills, they're just hungry for more, and they're constantly seeking out what are the new things in this market that they want to discover. And that's great because the world does not stay still.
We talked about kind of the digital skills from the perspective of the employees and the workforce and what they need to do in order to kind of be better equipped to be part of that digital transformation. Now, on the other side of the equation are, I wouldn't say digital skills of workers, but more digital literacy of the general population. It could be kind of the retirees. I think with COVID forcing more things online, more services online, kind of need to become more adept at being able to use technology well and protecting themselves from dangers like online fraud or kind of cyberbullying. What advice do you have to those people who are not necessarily looking for jobs, but just need to kind of train up their digital literacy skills?
Well, I would hope that there are plenty of places to go to help with gaining those skills. Funnily enough, I had an appointment at the optician the other day, and there was somebody who came in, and they were really struggling because the only way you could get an appointment now with COVID was to book to come into the optician in advance, and the only way you could book was to do online. And this pensioner basically couldn't do that because she didn't have a computer, she didn't have a smartphone, she had an iPad, but she really used it to look at photographs, etc., maybe do the odd puzzle. So it's really important. I think it's important for all of us to be aware of that when we're building new services, because there's always going to be some proportion of the population who are not going to be as digitally savvy. And I've done a lot of work with the UK government digital service. You know, they're brilliant at thinking through this about how can you build services that are available to everybody, including those who don't have digital. Even though you're building a digital service, it's like, what is the offline version? So I think that's really, really critical. And I would love to see lots of organizations helping to support that. For example, one of the things I did when I was at The Guardian, it was really rewarding. The Guardian has a volunteering week, and once a year, there would be a week where all staff would be able to have up to 5 days to go and volunteer for a charity. And I remember I went to a charity called Age UK, which is for older people, a charity for older people. And myself and my Guardian colleagues, we ran a sort of technology open house. So people could come and they did with their phones or their iPads, and they just wanted help to know, how do you switch it on? How do I send a photograph? How do I send an email? And that was just such a rewarding few days, because the joy that you brought by just helping somebody be able to send an email to their grandchildren was just really wonderful. So I think it'd be great if more of us took time out to do that sort of stuff.
Now, on that note, just out of curiosity, when The Guardian became more digital-centric, how does the demographic of the readership look different once it made that switch? So my data points are slightly out of date, but I suspect they haven't changed very much. But there was a very different user base for digital as it was for print, and even in digital it changed. So not surprisingly, in print you would have a lot of readers who would be sort of over 40 who are buying newspapers. In fact, sort of over 45, if not 50. Funnily enough, we had a Kindle version. Kindle readers skewed even more old. And they tended to be in their 60s. So you can have a digital product, but it didn't necessarily bring you younger audiences. But then obviously when you have things like the website, you'd have people who were definitely a lot younger. When you had the phone and mobile, that would be skewing even younger, etc. There's a really interesting. I worked many years ago. I used to work at BBC News, sort of doing the strategy team. And one of the things we often did work on was this idea that people under 25 weren't interested in news. I think today that concept's been blown out of the water. They may not necessarily go to news websites, and they may not be downloading news apps, but they are getting so much news from places like social media, now from voice, etc. So we now have a range of digital products that actually reach the whole spectrum of the population, and that's kind of wonderful. And lastly, on digital transformation, we talk about kind of how to transform corporates, right? Now, one organization I think that is in need of digital transformation is the government, regardless of which country you're in. Do you have a perspective on how kind of the building blocks for transforming the government or government services digitally are different from the building blocks for private corporations?
So there are a couple of things that are different that I think we've already touched on. One, you have to reach 100% of people. So even if you are building digital products, you have to think of that small percentage who do not have access to that product. So, for example, let's say you're building an application for your passport. Well, unfortunately, there are going to be some people who are never going to apply online. So you need to provide a route. So I think that's very different. I think the second piece is that this is both different, but I'd like to think that it doesn't necessarily have to be a truth that doesn't change, is that government is relatively slow moving. Well, let's be honest, it moves at a glacial speed. And I think that's one of the really hard things when you attract great digital people working in government. But I don't think it should be like that. So I think there's somehow or another government has to become more open to moving at a more pacey side. But that's hard because the crushing weight of government, the bureaucracy, the administration, you're asking people to work in very, very different ways. So that is a Herculean task. We've talked about digital transformation, and most people leading digital transformation have to deal with pockets of resistance of different stakeholders in their organization. When you're working in a digital group within government, the weight of the rest of the bureaucracy is just so overwhelming. And I think that's really difficult. But one thing I would say, we talked about the power of vision, the idea of working for a purpose-driven organization. You know what? What is more purpose-driven than going to work for the government to build services for the betterment of society? I mean, that's a wonderful mission. So the great thing about government is that it should have no problem hiring and attracting fantastic people. It just has to create the conditions that allow them to do magic.
Tanya, we're coming towards the end of the podcast, so I'm going to kind of end it with a final question back on the media industry. This question has two parts. The first part is, what is your prediction for the year when we will kind of see the last newspaper that is printed? And then number two is, what do you think will the future of the media industry look like?
Oh, so let's take the first one. I'm not sure. I think you will always have newspapers in some shape or form, but it'll look pretty different. I think you'll be able to sort of download and print a newspaper in your home at some point if you want to. So I think the idea of newspapers being ubiquitous in every corner shop in all parts of every nation, I think that will disappear because the economics of distribution just do not make sense. But I think for a long time yet, we're going to see newspapers in some shape or form. As I say, it might be that technology means you print them out at home or what have you, and you're not printing out all of it. For example, I never read the sports section, so I don't want to waste paper and ink on the sports section. But yeah, so they'll be around for a while. In terms of the media industry as a whole, well, I think we are due a new wave of startups, and with the rise of things like AI and machine learning, I'd really like to see some interesting new startups begin to tackle some of the media giants. We are beginning to see some of them, but I'm not sure anybody's got a huge amount of traction yet. You're getting some interesting ones in, say, for example, the field of sport. But I would like to see a sort of kind of a new wave of disruption over the next 2-3 years, which turns everything on its head. I think that would be pretty exciting.
Oh, Tanya, it's been great talking to you today. Thank you very much for joining us. I mean, we talked a lot about kind of how digital has transformed the media industry and what kind of a good piece of digital content looks like. Well, I'm hoping today this conversation is one of those and it finds its way to the right people. Thank you very much for joining us and sharing us your perspective today.
Thank you so much. It was my pleasure.
Thank you very much. And for anyone listening in, if you want to tune into more of these kind of conversations with business leaders around the world, please do tune in every Wednesday to our podcast, In the Name of Work, through Salmon Podcast. Thank you very much.